Hello and welcome back to Wine with Andy. I'm Andy. Today we're moving on to the second of our essential building blocks of wine flavour, acid. So I hope you're ready for a bit of a trip with me, if you see what I did there. Now I let you know last time the wines you're going to need for this tasting. One of them's a Chenin Blanc and one of them's a Viognier. The country was up to you, so I've got mine from France. The Chenin Blanc is from kind of the middle of France and the Viognier is from the south of France, but whatever you've got is great. So, acid. Now, acid is kind of one of those things that you don't normally pay too much attention to, but it makes a huge difference to the wine. And it's something that's characteristic of the grape variety it's made from. That's why I chose specific grape varieties to ask you to find. And there are some things that you can do in the vineyard or in the winemaking process that change the acid a little bit, but it's mostly down to the grape variety. So Viognier is a low acid grape variety and Chenin Blanc is a high acid grape variety, and we should be able to taste that in just a minute. Okay, so let's get on to tasting. I've got my two identical wine glasses here as normal, ready to go. So let's get pouring. I'm going to put the Viognier into my left-hand glass. And I'm going to put the Chenin Blanc into my right-hand glass. There we go. So, you'll know what comes first. Look. Let's pick these up and look. Now, we're not going to be able to see the acid. It's not that obvious. But for the first time, we're actually comparing two different grape varieties. The previous tastings, we've always been looking at the same grape variety in both glasses. So you might be able to see a little bit of difference. So I can see in mine that the Chenin Blanc is kind of a more golden colour, whereas the Viognier is a little bit greener in its colour. And that colour is a characteristic of the grape variety. So that's where that difference is coming from. Now let's pick this up and start with a sniff. So I'm going to pick up my Viognier and give that a sniff. Now, we also can't smell acid, so what we're doing here is just going through the normal motions of wine tasting. So we're thinking about the category of fruit. So I'm getting on my Viognier something a little bit peachy maybe, thinking stone fruit, quite fresh, so ripe, fresh kind of fruit. So remember, we've got category of fruit and we've got ripeness of fruit as two separate things. Now in the Chenin Blanc, I've got apple. It's ripe, verging on overripe actually. But definitely apple is the characteristic, that sort of green apple fruit. So we've done the first round of sniffing now. Let's swirl and sniff. So Viognier first. Okay, there's much more of that fruit coming out at me now. Still kind of peachy, like cut peach, nectarine, that kind of flavour, and still that fresh, nice ripe kind of flavour, not overripe, not underripe. In the Chenin Blanc, bit more apple, something a little bit sort of nutty almost as well. That could be from the winemaking techniques. Nutty flavours often come from extended contact with the yeast during the winemaking process. So you'll notice that I've got different characteristic flavours in these wines. There are some similarities, they both to an extent taste of white wine, but we've got them next to each other and we can taste that and we can smell rather that there are different flavours And those flavours are coming from the grape varieties. So peach is a characteristic of Viognier, and apple is a characteristic of Chenin Blanc. You'll find those flavours repeated in different wines made from the same grape variety. Okay, we've done our sniffing. Now on to the bit where we can finally actually spot the difference in acid. Putting it in our mouth, tasting the wine. So acid, we'll remember, I've mentioned a couple of ways to look at acid in wine. One is just holding it in your mouth and feeling the acid on your tongue. So the acid will start to prickle, tingle, maybe even burn a little. It sort of feeling won't actually burn your tongue, you're completely safe. And the other, of course, is the dribble test, which I mentioned last time, which is where after you swallow it, the amount you salivate after you've swallowed the wine has a correlation with the amount of acid. So the more you dribble, the more acid is in the wine. Let's give this a try on the Viognier first. I'm going to have a sip and just hold it on my tongue for a little bit and see how it feels. Okay, so there's definitely acid there. I'm getting a bit of a tingle. It's actually really quite crisp. It supports that flavour, that peachy flavour quite nicely. I mean, I guess you know how a nice peach can be quite acidic actually. It's got that sort of crispness to it, but it's quite comfortable. I could comfortably sit there with that wine in my mouth and not feel any discomfort whatsoever. Let's move on to the Chenin Blanc. So, there's a little bit more acid. It's not hugely apparent in the mouth actually as I hold it in my tongue, but I can definitely feel myself salivating a lot more after swallowing the Chenin Blanc than after the Viognier. And you might find it's a bit difficult to spot the difference first off. The first thing you'll taste, the first wine you put in your mouth, is going to taste a little bit more acidic than it actually is because you're not comparing it with something acidic from before. So you might have to go back and forth a couple of times to really spot the difference. And this is the start of something a little bit more challenging. Acid can be quite subtle, and of course I mentioned last time about the idea of balance. And of course, these winemakers may have included slightly different amounts of sugar in their final wines, and that allows it can balance out the acid so it doesn't feel as strong as it is unless you really pay attention to it necessarily. The other thing that acid really affects in wine is the kind of overall feel of it in the mouth. And you might notice this or you might not, it doesn't matter. But if there's not very much acid in the wine, it can sometimes feel a little bit oily. Whereas if there's a lot of acid, it will feel nice and crisp and refreshing and light. You might notice that, you might not, as I say. I'm going to have another go and just go back and forth and compare. So I can definitely notice in my wines that the Viognier has a slightly richer, more unctuous, good word, texture to it than the Chenin Blanc. That's much cleaner, crisper. So, I guess the important thing though, beyond thinking which you like, which we should do as well, but we'll have a little side waffle before that, is, well, what is acid actually useful for? So acid in wine is really useful for food matching because the acid works really well with fattiness in food. The acid helps to cut through the fattiness, the greasiness, the oiliness in the food. It helps clean out your mouth so you can taste the food better and it doesn't get all clogged up with grease. And equally, the fattiness of the food helps to balance out the acidity of the wine so that you can get a more sort of rounded impression of the wine. So it kind of makes both taste better. And that's important to bear in mind now as you're tasting these wines. So you might prefer one of them now without food and one of them with food, especially fatty food. And perhaps there's a little experiment you could do, a bit like last time when I was trying spicy and plain popcorn. You could get a little bit of bread and some nice oil and try both of these wines with the bread and the oil. And you might find that one of them goes better with just bread and one of them goes better with bread with that sort of fatty oil on it. And because the acid in the wine can cut through that oil and lift it a little bit. So bearing that in mind, let's go back and try these and have a think about which we prefer. So right now, without any food, without any fatty food, I definitely prefer the Viognier. The Chenin Blanc is really a little bit too sharp. I would have a glass or two of it maybe, but not very much because it would just get too much. That acid would get too much without having anything to sort of balance it out. So this is useful information, of course, because when you're choosing wine, you'll know if you're just wanting a wine by itself, you might prefer the lower acid, or you might well prefer the higher acid even there. So you can pick by grape variety, because it's the grape variety that is the main thing that's going to be controlling this acid. So some examples of high acid grape varieties, well, Chenin Blanc is a high acid grape variety. So is Riesling, we tried Riesling last time. So is Sauvignon Blanc. Low acid grape varieties, well, we've got a Viognier here today, and that's a low acid grape variety. Another one is a Gewürztraminer, that's another white wine. On the reds, well, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, they're both high acid grape varieties, whereas things like Grenache, often from the south of France, or Tempranillo, which is what Rioja's made from, those are both lower acid grape varieties. And things like Merlot and Chardonnay, which we've also tried before in this series, are kind of in the middle. So those are some things to look out for, but a quick Google will tell you which wine varieties are high acid and which are low acid if you're in doubt sitting there looking at a menu. So, talking of Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon, we've not yet mentioned the wines for next time. And funnily enough, those are exactly the two wine varieties I'd like you to get. So I'd like you to get one bottle of Pinot Noir and one bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. Both from the same country, just like this time, the country is up to you. I've gone for Chile, so I've got one Chilean Pinot Noir and one Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon. And the reason I want you to get these wines is because we're going to be looking at tannin next time. Tannins are those things in red wine, of course, that dry our mouths out and that make it go very well with meat. And we're going to be looking at a low tannin wine versus a high tannin wine. So we'll be doing that comparison. So go out, see what you can find, choose the country, up to you. As per this week, you might like to think back to when we compared the Merlots from a hot climate and a cool climate to choose the country that you go for. Australia could be another good option. France could be a good option. I've gone Chile, like I said. So up to you. And I'll see you for that next time. Cheers.